Welcome to episode 15 of the WPCampus podcast, a podcast for those using WordPress in higher education. WordPress is popular in higher ed for a lot of reasons, and being open source has to be near the top of that list. That means that you, yes, you, can contribute bug fixes and new features to the project, but actually showing up and contributing can be intimidating. How do you get started? My name is Brian DeConinck at NC State University. I am joined by Joe McGill. Joe previously worked for Washington University in St. Louis and now works with the WordPress development firm Human Made. In January, he spoke at WPCampus Online on the topic, Showing Up, Learning How to Make a Contribution. Joe joins us today to talk more about contributing code back to WordPress and contributing to the things that we use and care about more generally. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for coming on. So you gave this talk for WPCampus Online, and it all came out of what you've done with responsive images and WordPress. So since there are folks who might be listening and who are part of the WPCampus community who aren't developers, could you tell us a little bit about what responsive images are and why we should care?
Sure. Yeah. So responsive images is, to simplify, generally a term that is sort of used as an all-encompassing term to cover lots of browser technology that has been developed over the last several years that allows web developers to put images in their website with some extra information so that servers can send users the right size image for their device, whether they're on a small screen, a large screen, whether they've got a Retina screen or like a single DPI sort of screen, just to help for performance and keep everything looking really nice and crisp.
Mm-hmm. So it's, I'm on my smartphone and I don't need the huge high resolution, something.
That's correct.
So it's not, dare I say, it's not the most exciting thing in the world. What was it about this that grabbed your attention and made this like, this is a thing you're excited about that got you? I mean, so in your talk, you talk about how you started out presenting at WordCamp about responsive images. Why did you want to talk about responsive images at WordCamp?
Yeah, so I think lots of the conversation around responsive images started happening not too long after responsive design sort of caught on, which was after Ethan Marcotte's sort of big article on A List Apart in 2010, I think. Mm-hmm. So what quickly happened when people started doing these responsive websites is that they realized that a lot of designers are on these big fancy screens with really high Retina sort of details in their screen, and they want to make sure that the sites look super crisp, and so they were putting gigantic images in their websites. And then for folks that are on smaller screens like phones, especially at that time, Retina screens weren't as big of a deal. I think almost all new phones now have Retina screens, but at the time it wasn't as big of a deal, and screens were much smaller, and lots of folks are on slower networks. And so we'd have these big images that were being sent sort of across the network to these smaller devices, and it's just a bad situation. It's a bunch of wasteful data that makes the pages load slower and all that sort of thing. And so I was working on mostly front end web development around that time, and performance was a big priority, and it's still something I care quite a bit about. And so this effort that was underway to sort of solve that problem caught my attention. I thought it was really interesting. And one of the things that I also really thought that was interesting about it is that the folks that were the most involved in solving that were not the browser developers themselves, but was actually web developers who they were the ones who were being confronted with this problem, and they were the ones who sort of set out to try and solve it in a very sort of do-it-yourself sort of way, which was kind of neat.
Right. It was almost the sort of grassroots movement of like, let's figure out a way to solve it.
Yeah.
So you talked about it at WordCamp.
Yeah.
And then somewhere from there to maybe a year or so later, a little over a year later, responsive images are a part of WordPress 4.4. They're a part of WordPress core. What happened from one to the other?
It sounds really simple when you put it that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I joke with folks a lot, at like my local WordPress meetup or people, that other developers that I work with, that, one of the best ways to learn something and to get your head into something is to do a presentation about it. And that's sort of what happened to me with that WordPress talk at the WordCamp in St. Louis in 2014. Really, it was a good chance for me to really to better understand both the responsive images work in the status that it was at the time. It wasn't yet sort of codified in the official HTML that it is now, but it was on its way. And so to learn sort of where things were at that point and how you could best make use of that technology in WordPress helped me sort of onboard into that process. Mm-hmm. And I had started kind of paying attention to WordPress development and contributed a bug fix or two around that point, and was looking for bigger contributions I could make or bigger projects I could get involved in, and happened to hear that some folks were planning to try to do responsive images in WordPress, and it just ended up being sort of a right place, right time sort of situation for me, where I had just done kind of all of this research on my own to better understand responsive images and WordPress and kind of how you might do that in your theme or whatever. And so it was just a perfect alignment of my interests at the time. Mm-hmm. So I started to get involved at that point, and that's sort of how I discovered that project was happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about getting involved with making WordPress. So yeah. at the time, it was like a collection of IRC groups, right?
Yeah.
Now it's all consolidated into Slack.
Yeah, I think that was about the time that things moved over to Slack, but yeah, it was sort of in that sort of time frame. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I first discovered that there was sort of a public place where you could go watch the conversations that were happening around WordPress core development, mm-hmm. and you could track not just the release to release progress, but you could see what are the ongoing projects that people are working on. You can actually watch the conversations, see how decisions are made, and that there was a weekly conversation, and then I did learn after the fact that there's lots of other sort of subgroups that converse. But the fact that it's all public and you can watch them, you can follow along, you can participate in them was mm-hmm. Fairly mind-boggling and life-changing in some ways for me. Whereas before it was sort of like, all right, wait for a new release to happen, read the developer notes and go like, all right, what are all the things that I need to make sure that I fix in my code before this release comes out and we put it out to, our campus or whatever. Now I could actually like see the development as it was happening and be a little more in the loop. And it's something anybody can do. I think if you just go to, I think it's chat.wordpress.org and sign up, mm-hmm. you can get in the Slack channel and be involved today. It's pretty cool.
So I am in that Slack group and I do watch, and it's a little intimidating just on the speed at which things happen. Like, if you're following the core, like #core channel, I was saying before we started recording, today turned into a 3-meeting day. So when I get done with all of my meetings, I'm probably going to come back and there are going to be maybe 150 messages in there or something like that.
Right.
So how do you deal with the volume? How do you come to terms with like, there's so many people involved, there's so many people trying to put their ideas forward. How do you find your niche so that you can actually contribute?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, the first thing that I would not even try to attempt is to read all the things, because there's just too much to read. Like to try to assume that is a prerequisite to being able to be prepared to contribute in a meaningful way is just not realistic. So a couple of things. I would start out by telling people there is a weekly development meeting. It happens every Wednesday, depending on your time zone. It's a different time.
Sure.
But it's in the afternoon where I'm at here in St. Louis. And that happens every week. And so that's a good first place to sort of show up and sort of get the collection of what's the big agenda items. Mm-hmm. You can watch the make.wordpress.org /core blog. Mm-hmm. That will contain sort of bigger summaries of things that are happening. And so you can kind of keep up with sort of the major pieces. And I'd say those are the first two places that I would encourage people that are interested to sort of like keep an eye and just sort of kind of know what's going on. But then as you realize that like there's some particular focus that you're really interested in, whether it's media or accessibility or multi-site or the customizer or the API or, you know, all sorts of different things that you might be focused in. There are generally teams that are focused on those particular efforts, and they will have their own weekly meeting at a certain point during the week. And so you can do a lot just by paying attention to, you know, just the one or two things that you were interested in. And even those, you know, you don't have to show up every week for.
Right.
And that's kind of the first way that I would get involved.
So let's talk a little bit about what you actually did with these responsive images.
Yeah.
You know, people from my group have contributed bug fixes, and it's usually, you know, we realize that in the latest version, there's a typo here and it's impacting this one really minor use case or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty straightforward change. You know, you report that and you watch it come through. What you were working on is a lot bigger than that. You were creating new functionality and changing the way WordPress handles images. So walk us through how you go about adding something on that scale.
Well, first of all, I mean, at least in terms of that feature, it was a feature that I knew, you know, the conversation started before I got involved. So it was already a feature that that core lead developers were interested in, that they, you know, had sort of green lighted as something that would be considered.
Right. And I don't mean to overstate, like, you know, you were the one man who made it happen.
Goodness, no, absolutely not. I happened to be involved with a team of great developers, and people who just, you know, some people who just showed up and fixed one little piece of the thing, and weren't involved the whole way through. But, you know, I think one of the things that people often maybe don't take advantage of is the fact that there is lots of ongoing work on big features happening all the time. So currently there's a big project to recreate a new version of the editor in WordPress. It's one of the big focuses that we've got going right now. There's a team of people working on it, but that team is sort of an open for all comers. So if particularly if you have you know, a big interest in editors, you know, text editors and the way that works in WordPress, if you've got some JavaScript skill, but even not, if you just something you're interested in, that's a great place to get involved. So it's a feature that's already sort of got some steam going and that sort of thing. And responsive images was a similar sort of situation for me, where conversations had started and I had an interest. And so I went to find out kind of how could I get involved. And so that project and the editor project is a good example of this too. That feature was started to be built as a plugin. And a lot of that development work actually happened in GitHub, which is sort of outside of the way that WordPress contribution happens for most things, which happens sort of in our own bug tracking system called Track that we maintain. And that in and of itself can be kind of intimidating to people because it's just not, you know, familiar, I think, to most people who are doing open source work these days. But the, you know, for me, it was getting involved there and starting to figure out, you know, is there, you know, let's test what work has happened at this point and give feedback. And because I had done some work, you know, understanding both how media works in WordPress and how responsive images sort of works, I just happened to see a couple places right off the bat that I could contribute some things that I noticed that I could fix. And so I submitted a pull request to the plugin author who had started, a developer out of New York named Tim Efko, who's a great guy. And went back and forth, and he ended up, you know, saying, yeah, that looks good. Let's add it. And as soon as I saw that first sort of like green check mark that, you know, something that I wrote was, you know, going to be a part of this thing, it was sort of an addicting feeling that, you know, just sort of kept me going to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And then over time, what I thought was going to be like a, I'll just show up and maybe fix a bug or two, turned into me, by the time like a year had passed, being one of the lead developers on that project. And so that certainly wasn't the goal at the outset, but it's just following those little bitty incremental contributions that end up turning into something bigger than what you would expect at times.
Right, they hook you with a green check mark, and then it's just all your time.
They do. That can be the case. Yeah.
So you, at the time you were working at Washington University, St. Louis, I'm guessing with a reasonably small web team, because that's how universities are.
Yeah.
What's it like working on a project with this distributed global open source community, like culturally and just in terms of how you approach your work? How's it different?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was fortunate at Washington University to be a part of a pretty big team, relatively speaking, for higher ed. I think when I left WashU, the team was all said a little over 12 folks, including designers, content people, and all that sort of thing. And so it was a rare special place in that sense. But working on WordPress development, which is this big global project, very asynchronous in terms of communication, is a very different thing than sharing an office with folks and just like whiteboarding stuff. In some ways, it's really cool to be able to work on a project where, I mean, one of the lead developers that helped with responsive images at the time, I think, was based out of Spain, from Barcelona, and so there were often times where I'd work on something in the evening, and then leave notes, and then the next morning when I'd wake up, he had already pushed things forward quite a bit, and so there's this sort of like interesting cycle where we could sort of hand off to each other. But it means that you've got to be much better at communicating via text, and communicating via email, and being able to sort of work independently and that sort of thing. And it's something that I've, it's worked for me. It's been sort of nice to be involved that way. And then now at Human Made, it's very similar. We've got, a globally distributed team of people who are just experts at WordPress, and being able to work with folks in all different time zones is some communication challenges at times, but it's nice that you don't have to just be limited to working with people that you have to be in proximity with in terms of, local space, that sort of thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Did you know any of the, interact with beforehand, or just know of their work, any of the people that you worked with on the responsive images, any of the other developers?
No, not at the time when I started. One of the things that was really helpful as we sort of got closer to, we started as a plugin and got a lot of people to test the plugin, and got good feedback before we ever tried to introduce it as a WordPress core feature that we would merge into core itself. When we got to the point where it was starting to be like close to what I would call maybe a beta for people to test to put in the core, a couple of developers that had been core developers sort of jumped on and sort of helped us, just because we didn't have a lot of experience in terms of core development, helped us sort of traverse that sort of process,
right?
Which was super helpful. Mike Schroeder, who is one of the core committers, it was instrumental in really helping, and has since become a good friend because of that process. And so, and oftentimes, I mean, I found that we would go to one of those, Wednesday development meetings and, give a status update, towards the end of the project, and say like, here's this one tricky bug that we, are kind of stuck on. And, within a couple of days, somebody had sorted it out for us, and so there were lots of times, and I think this was probably one of the most important lessons for me in the process, is there was lots of times where, the challenges, the technical challenges, particularly that the project presented, felt way past my ability to be involved in. And there were definitely, those times of imposter syndrome that I think we get at times,
Right.
where it's like, I don't have the chops to make this happen. And the reality was that I didn't need to make it all happen. Like, there was a global community, as we mentioned, of people who were interested and who, when you ask for help, somebody inevitably would show up out of the woodwork and happen to know the thing that you didn't know that was the key to unlocking the problem. And that was a really rewarding experience to be a part of as well, to see that, like, what a community can do as a group when you kind of pool resources, and to know that you don't have to solve it all yourself to contribute. Sometimes all you need to do is show up and say, hey, we're doing this thing, and I'm going to ask for help, and just keep the ball rolling. I had I think a moment, kind of a couple months before that core merge, where I remember distinctly thinking to myself, like, I don't know that I have the ability to make this happen, but I know that if I just quit because I feel like I don't have the chops, if I just give up, this project's definitely gonna suffer. So I can keep working on it and keep pushing it and keep showing up until, somebody who actually has the power to make the decision that, like, yeah, this isn't good enough, like, gives that feedback and says, no, it's not ready, keep working, or somebody else comes and says, like, we just need to transition, somebody else needs to do this. Because if I stopped working on it, it was gonna suffer.
Sure.
But if I kept working on it, at least there was opportunity for it to move forward. And then after that, it was sort of out of my hands, and that was a good thing to sort of get my head around, because it's easy to just kind of go, like, nah, I can't do this.
Yeah. And so I just re-listened this morning to your WPCampus Online talk.
Yeah.
And you talk about, like, I don't remember exactly what you said, but it's something like, doing as much as you can when you can, and just being confident in, you've contributed that much and you'll contribute that much more, and so on, so on.
Right.
So with this imposter syndrome dynamic, I guess, did you ever reach a point where you just sort of stopped and thought to yourself, I belong, this is obviously something that I can do. I am on top of the world.
I wish I could say that, yeah, there's a point where you kind of go, like, yeah, no, I'm totally qualified for this. I think, and I think that this is an individual personality thing. I think some people just innately have the self-confidence to be less prone to that than others. But generally, I think that most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, have that voice inside our heads that says, like, everybody else around you that is your professional peer or whatever, they've got their act together better than you have. They've got, they know more than you know. And if anybody found out what you actually know, like, you would be laughed out of the room, kind of a thing. I mean, I think that's particularly, and I think, at least, I started doing web development, tinkering back in the 90s, and at that point, all web development was fairly do-it-yourself. I think a lot of us in the web development industry have done a lot of self-learning, comparatively, to other fields that are maybe more, professional track, with very, very obvious sort of steps in the process. And so I think that there is, in some ways, probably a higher, I mean, this is just a guess on my part, but I think that there's probably a higher percentage of people that work in the web that have that feeling of, I don't know that I belong here, because so many of us have done things, learned things on our own, and don't have that sort of external validation, that, like, a PhD program would give you, or
Right.
you know what I mean? Something that says like, yes, you took this test and you are now a certified JavaScript expert, or, whatever,
Right.
like, so it's really easy to question, did I, am I as good as I should be? And so I think that's just a thing that, you got to be honest with yourself and say, like, all I have to offer in this situation is what I have, and I'm going to work hard to do that well, and I want to keep learning and sort of let the results be their own thing, and not get too hung up in the results of the work that your sort of your ego or your self-esteem sort of hinges on it.
Mm-hmm.
Because that can be a crazy maker, I think, for anybody.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you let's skip to the end of the story.
Sure.
WordPress 4.4 comes out, and responsive images are a part of that. And you said in your talk you were at WordCamp US, and they made the announcement of the new features, and people applauded when responsive images were named.
Right.
How'd that feel?
It felt good.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie, it felt good. Yeah. It was a project that me and several other folks had been working on for quite a long time, and so I think the biggest sort of joy was just to see that it happened, and to be able to count myself among the people who were a part of it. But it's certainly like was an added sort of just an added privilege, really, to be able to sit in a room with, a bunch of people that are passionate about WordPress that showed up to, the US WordCamp, and have, I think Scott Taylor was the one who announced the feature, and to have, a room of people applaud, and to have the realization that like the feature itself was something that was, that was something that enough people cared about that they would have a reaction like that to the fact that WordPress now includes this feature. And so it was more about, a thing that needed to happen, an idea that was bigger than, any of us who worked on it, that needed to happen, that was the right time for it. And I just happened to be a player along the way that helped usher that thing into existence. It was a cool feeling. Yeah.
So you're still active in WordPress, making WordPress Slack and contributing code and things like that. What have you been working on lately?
Yeah. So since then, because I learned so much in the process, and that's one of the things that's great about getting involved in contributing to any sort of open source project that you use a lot, is you get a different sort of familiarity with the tools that you use every day when you're actually helping to work on them and maintain them. And so in the process of that project, I learned so much about the media component of WordPress. And WordPress, if you're not familiar, the way that it's such a big project that we sort of break up WordPress into these sort of sub-components so that people can kind of focus on different areas. And so I learned so much about the media component in the process, and stuck around trying to help fix bugs and stuff that came out of that work, that I was asked not too long after that to become a maintainer, a volunteer maintainer of the media code, which I've been doing since then. And that was around, I think, version 4 or 5. And then I think just before version 4.7, was asked to be a core committer. So now that means that I've done enough contributing, sort of over time, that the people who are lead developers of WordPress felt that they would trust me with sort of the responsibility of making changes to WordPress core. And that's certainly not something that I ever sort of sought out in the process, but has been a nice validator if there is one, that showing up and making a contribution is that it was not like it was worthwhile, I guess, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So I just keep working on media stuff mostly. Media has not been a big focus currently, with some of the big focuses in WordPress 4.8 being customization, the API, and the editor that I spoke of before. So there's some sort of long-term goals that we've got, but a lot of it's been just sort of maintaining and fixing little bugs as they come up. And there's lots to do with the media component. So if there are people who are interested in the WordPress media component, whether it's how we do images on the front end or the back end, or the media modal library and all that kind of stuff, we would definitely love to have more folks who are interested come volunteer in that place. Yeah.
So as somebody who's gone through this process of going from a regular web developer out there in the world to WordPress core committer, what do you think are some of the barriers that are keeping people from saying, yes, I'd like to get involved?
It's a good question. I think some of the barriers are just not knowing a starting point.
Right.
And so to that, I would say, a starting point is show up to some of those meetings. Usually the best way to get involved in contributing to an open source project is to fix your own problem. So if you're using WordPress all the time and you're developing on it and you encounter roadblocks, whether it be a bug, and you can track it down and go like, no, this isn't doing what I think that it should do, or there's a limitation to this functionality that makes it extra hard to do a thing. It's definitely something to bring up. It's definitely something, look and see if there's lots of bugs that have been reported over time. So look to see if that bug's already been reported. If it has, try to fix it. See if you can fix it and add a patch. And then if you can find what component it's a part of and message the people who in Slack that work on that component and just say like, hey, I'd love feedback on this. And sometimes it takes, a little bit of persistence because there's so much going on to make sure that like somebody has, can see it and will review it. That's really a good first way to get involved. But then, if once you sort of have a sense of how WordPress works and that sort of thing, and I think I probably just observed not just media meetings, like the WordPress developer meetings for 6 months to a year before I ever attempted a contribution. And I think there's something to, maybe not that long, but there's something to like understanding the rhythms of how WordPress development works, that helps not only you sort of set expectations for how that communication should happen, but makes it easier to sort of traverse that process when you kind of understand, that this is a globally, distributed project, and there are some major sort of focuses that people will focus on. And so just because something's super important to you doesn't necessarily mean that it's important to everybody right now. And that also doesn't mean that it's not important. It just means that, people have to prioritize their time a little bit. And so kind of understanding how that works is helpful. And so, yeah, I would start by kind of solving your own problems, and, jumping into the meetings that are relevant to your interests as you can. Probably is a good first step. Is that helpful at all?
I think that's very helpful.
Good.
I'm going to admit I'm still a little intimidated, but
yeah.
Do you think there's any... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so, I mean, to the question being, what are the barriers to entry? I think that other barrier to entry, and I think probably one of the biggest barriers to entry for almost any endeavor that you take on, right? Whether it's starting a new diet, or like starting a running plan, or like an exercise plan, or, picking up a new hobby, like, learning to play guitar or something, which is something that I enjoy doing. The hardest part is just to start, right? Like it's super, because I think a lot of times you have in mind the end point. And so it's like mentally, I have no idea how to get to the end point of this thing. And so it makes starting feel really hard. And so what I would do is make sure that if that is a goal that you wanna contribute to core, what I would do is make a goal for like a really small thing, which is I need to set up the WordPress development environment. And that's it. Like, I'm just going to do that. And then once you've done that, maybe go look at, we have in track, you can look for good first bugs. And there's actually a Twitter feed, like a Twitter channel now that sort of like spit those out every once in a while. So if you follow the WordPress good first bug Twitter account, you sometimes will see those links, and you can click and see, is this something that I'm interested in working on? And if so, like, just work on that one thing. And it's really easy in pretty much any sphere of any sort to compare like your starting point to somebody else who's way further along in the process, and to just go like, I don't know how I'm going to get from here to there, and so until I can mentally get my head around that, I'm not going to get started. And that's just an unrealistic expectation to put on yourself. And so, just taking that first little step, I think, is enough to celebrate and to go like, yep, cool, I did it. So now that I've done that, let's look at the next thing, and see kind of what snowballs from there.
In your talk for WPCampus Online, you framed all of this in terms of not just contributing back to core, but also just contributing to anything that matters to you. And I think all of the things you're talking about are really applicable very broadly, anything that you might be interested in or care about.
Right. Yeah. And I think, one of the things, so when I originally, I remember wrote up the proposal for that talk, it was the end of last year, and we have seen, I think, especially in the US right now, we've seen, a big jump in people over the course of not just, since the election, but I mean, over the last several years, people who have started to pay a lot more attention to what's going on around them, and not just pay attention. Some people have just paid attention from a social media standpoint, but I've been really inspired by people that I've seen and people that I know who have not just started to pay attention to the things that are around them, but have actually started to get involved. Right. And have started to say like, you know what, like this thing, whether it's my current job and where I'm at in my job, or what's happening in my community, or what's happening at my kids' school, or what's happening in whatever sphere matters to you. It's really easy to sort of go, okay, well, there's a problem, and it frustrates me. But if you can figure out like, okay, how do I actually like get involved in some meaningful way that can help make change. And I've just seen lots of people around me do that more. And maybe it's just, the age that I'm starting to see more peers of mine kind of do things that just inspire me every day. But in some ways, when I originally gave that talk, I had in the back of my mind that these are principles that I think can apply way beyond WordPress. It's, taking ownership and choosing to be a part of whatever solutions you want to see enacted in the world is something that I think people understate to themselves more often than they should.
Yeah, and I think I agree wholeheartedly with that. And it's interesting to see something very focused and something that I think about as, this is my job, this is what I do, to go into work, as a way of sort of framing and grounding this idea of how you influence the people around you in your community and in your life. I like that a lot. Yeah. So I'm going to try to, I don't know if this is going to work. I'm going to try to tie all this back together and bring it back to WordPress. So in higher ed, you hear a lot, especially on the academic side of things, about the importance of being involved in communities and giving back and being present in like the places where the universities are. Do you think that those of us who work on the website of higher ed, do you think we have a particular responsibility or obligation to contribute to these open source projects and these things like WordPress that we use? Or am I going too far there? Am I signing myself up for more work than I should be signing myself up for?
Well, I mean, I would say, first of all, I would hesitate to make that obligation word. Although, I think there is something about citizenship that applies to, our digital world as well. And I want to be careful a little bit because, you can very easily sort of get yourself into a mindset where you feel like you've got to work all of the time, because when you're not working at work, then you're working, you're working at home doing free volunteer, work in some ways. And a lot of people, burn themselves out that way and start to feel like they've taken on more than what they could really handle. And I would not encourage anybody to do that, for sure. But I do think that we're living in an interesting time where, because of our communication tools and all sorts of things, the sense of space and place that has traditionally been, physical location, is being blurred quite a bit with, sort of our digital space and place, right? And so as folks who work on the web and who spend a lot of their time on the web and probably have a lot of their social interactions happening, digitally with, either friends from all over the place from different times in our life or whatever, to be a part of helping to make the structures that are in that space is in some ways a kind of citizenry. You know what I mean? And so if you have the means to help contribute and to share your knowledge or to share some of your time, I think that's great. I know Matt Mullenweg several years ago at one of the WordCamps, sort of put out this idea of giving back 5%. And so if you are a company or a team that uses WordPress as a big part of your your business, that if you would carve out 5% company time to sort of give back, that would be a nice sort of way to participate in that sort of citizenry in the WordPress world. And I would say if you are at a university and using WordPress, and you can carve off a little time, whether it's one day a month that your team just focuses on contributions, or a couple hours a week that you can kind of focus some time on what can I do in WordPress. Not only is it really good for helping to move the WordPress project forward, but the investment of time, my experience has been that the investment of time you put into that sort of thing ends up paying back dividends in what you learn about the tools that you're using every day. It helps you be smarter about solving problems right there in your own team, in your own circumstance. And so I've gained more out of contributing to WordPress probably than I've put into it over the time that I've been doing it, for sure. And so it's definitely something I would encourage.
Oh, I think that sounds great. Thanks so much for joining me. And do you have anything else you want to add right at the very end? Any inspiring words to get somebody to go join that WordPress Slack group?
No, I mean, just if it's something that interests you, like the bar to entry is way lower than what you think that it is when you get started. So don't be intimidated. Folks are, super nice. So, or at least that's been my experience, as long as you, are kind to yourself, and be happy to join you.
All right. So if you haven't already heard, and I'm guessing you've heard,
I'll be there.
WP Campus 2017 will be held July 14th and 15th in Buffalo, New York. Early bird ticket sales just closed, but regular tickets remain on sale until June 30th. And I think everybody should be there. I think everybody should go. So if you can, last year's conference was great. I had a great time, and you don't want to miss it this year. Just as a reminder, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and on Google Play by searching for WP Campus Podcast. And you can listen to each episode and follow links to more information at wpcampus.org/podcast. For this episode, I'm going to make sure we have links to the WordPress version 4.4 release notes and things like that, so you can see all the details of the responsive image stuff that we talked about. Be sure to follow at WPCampus.org on Twitter for announcements about this year's conference, and also for news and updates about the podcast, the WP Campus community, and anything and everything else WP Campus. Whatever Rachel's inner thoughts are, it's all going to show up on the Twitter feed. And if you have a suggestion for this podcast, tweet it at WPCampus.org, and we'll see it and maybe invite you to be on the show. All right. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much.